Hi, welcome to the next session in data analytics for the social sciences. So we are in the third block, the block on unsupervised methods. And today we're going to look at different methods for dimension reduction. So dimension reduction is useful for data in very high dimensional space. And at the end of the previous lecture, I have explained how the word and document data that we're looking at for text analysis is such high dimensional space. So we can either think of it as a very high dimensional space where every dimension, every axis is defined by a word, and then the documents are positioned somewhere in this space depending on the words they use. Or we could have a very high dimensional space where the axes represent the documents and the words are positioned in this space based on the documents where those words are present. Either way, we are looking at high dimensions. So either in the data set where we look at, we talk about 4,000 dimensions if it's defined by the words, or 240 dimensions if it's defined by the documents. But either way, this is far beyond what we normally think of as a two-dimensional or three-dimensional space. So to visualize this data, for example, we need to reduce the dimensions to something that we can plot, 2 or maybe with a bit of luck 3 dimensions. To get a sense of what patterns are there, we might want to look at a lower dimensional projection to understand. If we are worried that there is a lot of noise in the data, a lot of there's some sort of essential features that are really at the core of what we're interested in, some relation between the topic of the document and the words that are used, for example, but there's also a lot of noise. There's a lot of reasons different words might be used at different times that have nothing to do with the topic. So to reduce the amount of noise in the data, dimension reduction can also be helpful. So there's different reasons why we might do this, and today we're going to talk about these dimension reduction techniques. So we are going to look at 3 methods actually, despite what the slide here suggests. Principal components is the main one. We're going to look at multidimensional scaling, and we're going to look at factor analysis. So very important to keep in mind that we are in unsupervised learning. So as I explained, unsupervised learning means that we are trying to find structure in the data. We find patterns in the data, clusters, groups, dimensions, different features. But there is no ground truth. There is no classification that we know already or dimension that we know already. So for example, if we have a set of independent variables and we want to see what the correlation is between those variables and the level of democracy, and we have a separate measure of what is the level of democracy, then we call this supervised learning. It is supervised because we know the correct classification. We know whether it's a democracy or not, or how democratic it is. And now we look at patterns between those variables and the classification that we know. In unsupervised learning, we do not know yet what the right classification is, and we are looking at whether we find patterns in the data. So for example, with the speeches data that we look at, we have not decided what the different topics are of those speeches, and we are trying to find out what those might be by looking at the underlying data. So unsupervised learning, that means there's no labeling of the data prior to our research. There might be some labeling after the analysis based on patterns that we find, but there is no labeling that is the input of the analysis. So we continue with unsupervised learning, and one major field of unsupervised learning is dimension reduction. And today we will talk about a number of those dimension reductions. And every time the case is that we have high dimensional data, and we can think of this in different ways. I think the example data we use in this course, the text data, is perhaps a sort of easier to understand version of high dimensional data. So you can think of this space defined by words where the documents are placed, or the other way around. But also high dimensional data is, for example, when many survey questions are taken together and we think about where a respondent is positioned. We might do a psychological analysis and we might ask you 30 or 50 different questions about your behavior or your attitudes or your views, and we might want to identify what kind of personality you have, right? So then we have high dimensions because there are so many questions we ask, and every respondent, every axis then is a different question. and every individual respondent is placed somewhere in that space depending on how they answered each question. That is also a form of high dimensional data, and we might reduce that to find some kind of underlying range of personalities, for example. That would be a form of dimension reduction. With dimension reduction, the idea is always to go from a plot in very high dimensions to a data set in high dimensions to a data set in few dimensions, for example, to produce a plot. Because plots, visualizations are only really possible in 2 or 3 dimensions. And then there's different methods to do dimension reduction. We will discuss 3 of the most common ones. Multidimensional scaling and factor analysis are very common in the social sciences. At least were actually more common. They were more common in the 1980s and 1990s than they are now. And principal component analysis is a very common tool in all kinds of statistical analysis, certainly also in data science and machine learning analysis. And in fact, there is close connections between these 3 methods. Factor analysis is closely related to principal component analysis, and multidimensional scaling is sometimes identical to principal component analysis in certain conditions. So all the time we are trying to go from a high coordinate system to a lower coordinate system. So perhaps I can annotate a little bit to give maybe that will help for intuition. So we might have a set of points that is in very high dimensions. So we have many axes. I can't draw them because that's, of course, I can only draw one. But think of a space with many, many dimensions. And points are located somewhere in that space. Yeah? And each point has a position on each axis. Yeah? So they are connected to each different of these axes. So for example, this point might score here on the first axis, and here on the second axis, and here on the third axis, and here on the fourth axis, and here on the fifth axis. It has a position on each of these axes. And if there's many of these axes, then it becomes impossible to draw this. And we want to transform this to a plot that, for example, has only 2 dimensions. Yeah? And where all the points are in those 2 dimensions that we can easily read. Yeah? And it has just a point on each of these 2 dimensions. Yeah? So we have, this is the dimension reduction step. This is the dimension reduction, because we go from something in high dimensions and we preserve most of the information in the data, but we get to something in low dimensions. And of course we lose a lot of information. From this, we cannot derive exactly the position in all those dimensions. From this, we can derive this, but not the other way around. So we lose information, but we add understandability, simplicity. This we can plot, we can try to compare the 2 axes, for example. This is very difficult to work with. Now, when you come up with an algorithm to go from high dimension to low dimension, you try to find an optimal way of summarizing it, something that preserves as much information here that was there. And the different algorithms all try to do this, but where they differ is which kind of information they try to preserve. So for example, all these different points in this space, they will have a certain distance from each other. You can use Pythagoras in high dimensions to figure out the distance between them, but they will have distances between them in that high dimensional space. Here, these points also have distances between them. And so one way that we can make this transition from high dimensions to low dimensions is a transition where the distances between the points here are as close as possible to the ones they had here. They won't be the same because we have lost a lot of information and you can't plot in 2 dimensions all the information that was in the high dimensions. But we can try to find such a way of finding those axes. We get 2 of those axes in that high dimensional space in such a way that as much of the distances here resemble the distances they had here. And so that is called multidimensional scaling. Multidimensional scaling is going from a high dimensional matrix to a low dimensional matrix in a way that preserves the distances between the points as much as possible. Principal component analysis finds a different way of a low dimensional space. It does it such that as much as possible of the variation in the data is preserved. If there are certain axes in this high dimensional space where data points differ a lot, some are very low, some are very high, and there are other axes where most of the points are sort of in the same area, it does not vary much. It is those first ones that will drive the results in this one. So for principal component analysis, we find the axis in such a way that as much as possible of the variation is captured. And in fact, the first dimension will capture most of the variation, and the second will capture the second most of the variation, etc. So the variation in the data in this low dimensional space is as large as possible given the variation that was in the original space. It's reduced because we go to a lower dimensional space, but as much as possible preserved. And finally, in vector analysis, it is more about the correlations. So it looks at correlations between different observations, and it tries to preserve as much as possible the correlations between these observations. The two are actually quite close, the variance and the correlation. So one preserves the variance, the other more like the covariance. It's not exactly the same, but it's closely related mathematically. So all three methods, whether you try to preserve the distances, or you preserve the variance, or you preserve the covariance, the correlation, in all these cases, these are methods to try to find the optimal way to go from high dimensional to low dimensional without losing too much of the information that is considered the more important information. So we go back to this high dimensional data set where in the lab, where we have either on the left here, a data of a high dimensional space where every term in the documents, 4,000 or so terms, defined a different axis. And we try to find some underlying dimension that still maps these speeches, but that does it in a way that either preserves the distances between speeches, or the correlation between speeches, or the variation between speeches. Or we go to the right data set where each axis is defined by a speech. The points in the space are defined by how often these words occur in each of the speeches. And when we go to this dimension reduction, we either find a space where the distance between terms, as in how different their word usage is preserved, or the variation in words between speeches is preserved, or the variation in words, the correlation between words is preserved. So I will start with multidimensional scaling in the next session.